Hey, Sam. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to be here.
Well, I'm excited to chat with you. You have written quite the book on marathon training, marathon racing, marathon recovery. It's perhaps one of the most comprehensive marathon training books that I've seen recently, which just really goes into detail on almost everything you'd like to know about how to train for a marathon, how to choose the right course. I mean, you've really left no stone unturned for those runners who want to have a great experience.
Oh, it's great to hear you say that. That's pretty much what I was setting out to do. Um, I felt that I'd actually written a book about marathons before, but it was a long time ago. I think it was actually 2004, and at that time, um, the marathon market was very different and much smaller. And so a book that was just sort of about the marathon that could be for everybody was an acceptable idea. And so anybody who hadn't even run a 5K before could pick the book up and read the advice and supposedly kind of end up running the marathon. But over those ensuing years with more experience of coaching, more experience of running myself, I think things have got to be more nuanced than that. And, the market has grown. There's much more, um, then the advice that is being given needs to be more specific to different groups of people. And I think what I found was happening was that the advice that is given out at the kind of elite level by the high profile coaches is just kind of extrapolated down. So a lot of the principles are still presented as being the same, but they're just kind of made a bit smaller. And I was finding that just doesn't really work. You have to kind of approach it in a different way altogether, rather than just sort of minimize the whole kind of training process to fit somebody who isn't running 100 plus miles a week or whatever. So I wanted
Not
to
everyone
aim.
can do that.
Well, exactly. I mean, a lot of us have these inconvenient things like relationships and jobs and family commitments, and we can't put all of our time and all of our energy into running, and whatever that those limitations that we have to be built into the training program that we put ourselves on. And I think that is one of the biggest reasons why so many people fall at the first hurdle. They, as soon as they're starting that big build up, it's such a steep curve that they're on in a lot of these kind of off the shelf programs that it's just the overload is too much and people break down or burn out very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I always try to work on in my coaching practice and in any of the content that I create is how do we make all this training work in your life? Because, like we were discussing, not everyone's going to be running 110 miles a week. Not everyone, has that luxury or even that physical ability. And I think what you've done with your book is really create this very accessible approach to the marathon where you can be a working single dad and you can go and train for a marathon and you can make it happen. So I definitely appreciate that because I work with a lot of adult runners who have those very annoying, inconvenient time sucks, like having a significant other or a job, those things that are just really getting in the way of their running. So we certainly have to make it
Yeah,
work.
but
What
you'd
I
be
would love to
forgiven for
do. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
yeah, you'd be forgiven for thinking when you read some of the programs of all the things that you have to be doing to kind of keep up the supplementary stuff to your running, and attending to your nutrition and your core training and your stretching and your strength training and all the different types of sessions. You'd be forgiven for thinking it's actually impossible to do all of that and have a normal life at the same time. And so I think we've got to kind of drill down into what is really important, and and that really requires us looking at our own lives and at ourselves and our strengths and our weaknesses. And I've got a chapter in the book called All About You, because I think that is a real missing part of the jigsaw. It's often left out. It's like people go and choose a marathon program like going to the supermarket and saying, yes, I'd like the sub 430, and picking that one off the shelf, and then hoping that by following that's going to produce the sub 430 time. And I think that program doesn't know anything about you. It doesn't know about your injury propensity, or what motivates you, what sort of runs you're good at and not so good at, how many times you maybe have never even run a race ever in your life, all of that stuff. The program doesn't know that. So it's just illogical to think that everybody who does this program here is going to result in, the same sort of finish time. So I just wanted to do away with that finish time thing and the sub 330 and the sub 4 and the blah, blah, blah. I just wanted to take that out and just say, let's look at you and your current place, and then let's look at how we can get you to the best of your potential over the time that we've got available. And then what you get at the end of it is what you get at the end of it. And I can't guarantee what the time will be, but it will be the best that you could have possibly done at that time, given those limitations.
Right. And I think your book is really interesting because it essentially is a book that dispels this myth that everyone has to follow, a very formal training plan to a T with absolutely no modifications for their own lives. And if they aren't able to do that, well, you just can't run that marathon. And you do a really great job of modifying marathon training for the average person who has all those other responsibilities. And, I've always been someone who said, a training plan is sort of like a set of directions to your final destination. You can take detours. You can go off script a little bit and still arrive at your final destination. And in fact, even as someone who sort of makes a living by creating training plans for runners, I'm the first person to say that training plan is just a roadmap and you can certainly modify it. I don't think I've ever followed a training plan myself where I didn't start to change things a little bit, even in the first week of that training plan. So I
Sure,
really
yeah.
think that's highly appreciated from my perspective, because I know that runners need that kind of flexibility. And Sam, I thought it would be fun today to talk a little bit more about some of these marathon myths that people tend to believe that I think often hold them back from achieving what they want to achieve in the marathon, potentially holding them back from even doing their first marathon. And so I'd like to discuss some of these fun myths and get your perspective on them. I think, the first one we've already talked about a little bit. You've got to follow a high level training plan and follow it to a T and not deviate it from it whatsoever. That's obviously untrue. And I really like how you've included that chapter in your book to discuss exactly that. What do you say to the person who says or believes that they just can't run a marathon? I don't have the body for it. I don't have the time. I don't have the physical fitness or athleticism. What would you say to that runner?
Well, that's an interesting one, Jason. I do think that, bar a few very, obvious kind of structural limitations that some bodies, will have. I think it is true that everybody can run a marathon, but what I think often is that sort of goes wrong is that people sort of embark on that program, the 16-week program or the 18-week or 12-week or whatever it is, out of Runner's World magazine or whatever, and they haven't really built enough of a base before they start. And so that means that first few weeks, the incline that they are having to climb up is so steep because they haven't even run 9 miles, say, for a long run before. And so they have to start at 9 miles, and then that's the longest run they've ever done. Then the next week they have to run 10 miles, and then the next week they have to run 11 miles, and this kind of really steep incline simply to get to the point where they're running, a half marathon after maybe 6 to 8 weeks into the program. Then you've only got a very short time to get a little bit sort of higher up the mileage scale than that, and everything just happens too intensely and too quickly. And so a statement that I've made in the book, which I know won't be popular with everybody, is that I think you should be comfortable running a half marathon before you start thinking about running a marathon. And I mean comfortable as in, it's something that you've done a few times. It doesn't have to be in a race, but that you can go out tomorrow and go and do that. And if that in itself is a massive challenge now, it's not the right time to do the marathon. It doesn't mean you can't do one, but it's just, why make it really hard on yourself? Because the other thing is people who are building up at that such a sort of a sort of steep incline are going to be out there for really long times when they're doing those long runs. And I've come across people, I'm sure you have too, when they're out doing a long run in, week 9 or 10, where they're saying, oh yeah, well, I had to do 20 miles. So I was out there for, 4.5 hours, 4 hours, 45 for a long run. And that length of time on your feet is going to be absolutely exhausting. And there needs to be a point where you're just going to cap that long run distance and not go by, you have to go by time, but just limit it at maybe 3 or 3 hours 15, something like that. Because that's when people talk about doing 20-mile runs, they're looking back, that all comes from the elite training sort of history, and that would typically be taking a couple of hours, not 4.5 hours. And that's one of those problems, like I mentioned earlier, about the extrapolation of just saying, yep, everybody should do this. We'll just kind of, translate this for the less accomplished runner.
I think this is arguably one of the most important issues in marathon training because it affects almost everybody. It affects even competitive runners, and it affects runners who have never done a marathon before. And that's just rushing the training and really, thinking that they can go from, that 9-mile long run to, maybe 18 to 20 miles, whatever it might be, in the course of a training cycle. And this really speaks to the idea that, something I say often is that there's no couch to marathon program. There's a couch to 5K program, but there's a very good reason why you can't go find a couch to marathon program. And that's for exactly the reason that you were discussing previously, which is you need to train for not just the marathon, you need to train for marathon training. You need to go into marathon training.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to already be capable to a certain extent. And your kind of benchmark is, let's be comfortable running a half marathon, 13.1 miles before we start the marathon cycle. I'm a little bit less aggressive. I like to see runners with at least a double-digit long run. Let's at least be comfortable running 10 or 11 miles. I think that's the bare minimum. But ultimately, I think slightly more is better. If you're comfortable running 15 miles for a long run, I don't really think you're going to struggle with marathon training. I think you're going to pick up on it very well, and going from 15 to 20 miles is probably not going to be that big of a jump. One question I had for you about this is, I think a lot of us have heard that before you run a marathon, you should try to run a 20-mile long run. And I think that's a good sort of general benchmark, but at the same time, there's a lot of cases where that rule just completely falls apart. And it has to do with the amount of time that you're running. Do you have a certain limit on a long run when it comes to the time on your feet that you're spending?
I do. I mean, I think, again, it will partly depend on whether somebody is completely new to running, or they've had a little bit more experience, because sometimes people have got quite a good level of experience, but they're just, not hugely fast. And so then they're going to be able to take a little bit more time on their feet because they've done that before, than somebody who is coming to that distance for the first time. But I usually say somewhere between sort of 3 and 3.25 hours is about how long I would want someone to do their long run, to sort of cap it at that distance. However, I think this approach that is so commonly seen in marathon programs, where you start at this low distance and then you build it up and you build it up and you build it up and up and up, and and then what happens is that your longest ever run happens before your longest ever race, and there's a small period in between, the taper, where you recover from that. But really, I like to see people getting to that peak marathon long run distance a lot earlier in the program, because they've reached that point. They haven't had to rush up this really, really steep slope to get there. They can then back off and they can focus a little bit more on building the sort of threshold pace and some speed, and start to build some quality training in there without having to keep going with this really exhausting long run at the same time. Then come back, revisit that distance again, back off again, and come back and start to throw some quality training into the long run as well as it gets nearer to the race, so that you're doing a little bit more of that long run at marathon goal pace. And I think that's probably one of the biggest differences between the programs that I've put in the book, is that you don't get to your peak long run as the sort of last long run before the taper. It happens a bit earlier into the training cycle than that.
I think a lot of runners might hear this and think that this makes the training more advanced. Oh, I'm going to get to my longer long run even earlier. I'm going to work on all this different type of speed work. I'm going to put quality running within my long run. Ooh, that sounds like an advanced move. And I think it's actually easier. I think it's actually easier to go with this approach than the more traditional approach where you spend most of the training cycle building your long run fairly aggressively from a somewhat of a low mileage long run, because the injury risk is a lot higher. You're really just rushing the training, and you're not going to have as much fitness at the end of that cycle as you would with this more varied approach. And it's just sort of like, I would rather study for 30 minutes a day for 2 months leading up to a big exam rather than an hour a night for 1 week leading up to the exam. It's sort of like that approach.
Yeah,
It's
it's a good
cramming
analogy.
for the marathon. And when you cram for a marathon, bad things can happen. Your injury risk is going to be higher. Your
Yeah.
performance is going to be worse. And I honestly think you're just not going to have as much fun out there on the race course. Because if you want a marathon to feel good, if you want to have a good time, I think it's in your best interest to be in as good of shape as possible, because then it won't be as stressful for you.
Absolutely. And the confidence that you get from having already hit quite a, decent long run distances earlier on in the program. There's not this sort of daunting sense of this, you do 16 miles and it's really exhausting. And then you've got to do 18, and then you've still got this big 20 coming up, and it's all sort of, it feels very, sort of intimidating. And I think the confidence you get from doing longer runs sort of earlier in the cycle, because you know that you're going to get some time where you're not going to have to go out and do an even longer one. You're going to get a little bit of time off from that before you come back to that. So I agree with you that it is sort of a kind of more approachable way of training. And I also think mentally it's the variety that you get, the focus is changing throughout the program rather than it just all going in one direction. You're bringing in little aspects of other training attributes along the way. And I think that makes it sort of more varied and more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just more fun to do, right? And it is almost the difference between how a pro runner might approach their training and how someone who's just going to try to get this marathon in the next couple months, by hell or high water, where the professional would probably be already very comfortable running a substantial long run. Their mileage is already
Yeah.
relatively high. And so it's almost like training a bit more like a professional, but scaled way back to a very approachable level. And I want to hit on one thing that you said earlier, too. When I asked about this myth that some people believe, oh, I can't run a marathon, you did say that there are some structural limitations that people might have that would prevent them from being able to train or race a marathon. Can you talk about some of those? Like what are the scenarios or the very specific limitations where you might advise a runner, hey, it may not be a good idea to go for a marathon?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think it's often things which have been caused by previous injuries. So people who have got very limited ankle mobility is a big one, which could have been through breaks, earlier fractures, and sometimes bones have been sort of fused together in that healing process. Part of it is, we've had to sort of fuse this bone, and people just have not got that mobility through the ankle, so they're just not able to sort of roll through the foot well. And really it is joint issues. So it might be people who've had knee or hip surgery replacements as well. I mean, that said, I do know people who have had arthroscopies and people who've had hip replacements who've run marathons. I'm not sure I know anyone who's had a knee replacement and run a marathon. I think if they did, their surgeon would probably be chasing them most of the way.
It's a good incentive to run faster.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm sort of talking about the bodies that have got asymmetries which have been caused by something that's happened to the body, really, that's created sort of a joint that just doesn't move as it's meant to. It's quite hard to be too specific about you wouldn't want to rule anybody out, because equally I know I've worked with someone with scoliosis who's run very well. Lots of strength and mobility work was necessary in order to sort of even out some of the asymmetries and imbalances that scoliosis caused. But it's certainly something that you need to think about if you're going to be raising your game and going for a marathon, if you have had injuries or sort of surgical kind of interventions, particularly in the lower limb.
Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of with you. I hate to count anybody out from the marathon, because I've seen people overcome amazing adversity to finish 26.2 miles. It's very likely that with enough drive and ambition and a good physical therapist and strength training program, you probably can overcome a lot and likely run that marathon. But like you said, it does require you to up your game. It requires you to not cut corners, really seek the help of
level.
100%. Yeah. Really seek out the help of a good physical therapist or strength coach, depending on what your limitation might be. So even if you think you can't run a marathon, you probably can with just a little bit of extra strategic work. Now, Sam, I have occasionally heard a complaint about running marathons, and this one usually comes from the non-marathoner crowd, that if you're someone who runs marathons, you are aging yourself faster than you have to. That just the act of training for and racing marathons hastens the aging process. What are your thoughts on that?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I guess that's to do with, the idea that running creates oxidation in the body, particularly, aerobic level running is creating oxidation, and oxidation is associated with aging. But at the same time that running is creating oxidation in the body, it's also, on the other hand, stimulating the release of more antioxidants. And so it's not increasing the sort of aging process in that way. It is actually, it's creating a demand on the body, and that demand acts as a stimulus for the body to respond to that extra demand. I mean, it's really how fitness works in lots of other aspects are the same. You create a challenge that is higher than the body can currently cope with. And so if you do that at the right level and you repeat it often enough, then the body says, right, I need to be able to cope with this in the future, because she's going to make me keep doing this. And so then the body responds by making changes in enzymes and hormones and tissue structure, and actually allows you to do that thing better as time passes. And that really is the kind of essence of overload and developing better fitness. So I think the same is true in terms of the factors that come into aging. What I have done, which is quite an unusual thing in terms of marathon training, is I have included some sprint work within the base phase. And I think that kind of ties in with this sort of aging issue a little bit, because What we do know is that as we get older, that we do begin to lose muscle mass, and running kind of, marathon pace running doesn't seem to be enough to prevent that atrophy, that loss of muscle, volume and tissue. It's really only, I mean, as you all know, of course, yourself, Jason, it's a huge amount of it's to do with strength training. But in terms of running, absolute maximal paced running, sprinting, whether that's on the flat or whether that is on little uphill sprints, which some listeners might have become familiar with, that have been talked about quite a lot over the last few years. Just very short uphill sprints are a really good way of kind of creating the stimulus that keeps muscle tissue strong and develops that prevents that decline, really. And so people might think, well, that's a bit weird. I'm not going to need to sprint, so why would you put sprinting into a marathon program? But putting it in that base phase, so you're there's no kind of challenging threshold work. There's no VO2 max sessions in this part of the program. It's all just about the easy miles and just kind of getting used to running on a consistent, regular basis. So you're not taxing your body too much in anything intense. And so just peppering the program with some of these little sprints is the perfect time to do it, because they're using a different energy system. They're creating a different stimulus, but they don't really leave you fatigued in the way that doing a track session would. Going around doing like 400s or 800s, very tiring. But this kind of thing, it's very short, intense. It helps with your running form, and it's just really, really helping to kind of prevent that muscle kind of atrophy that is an inevitable part of the aging process.
Yeah, I think that's really important to discuss. It's both, what is happening at the cellular level within your body when you do certain types of training. And when we talk about oxidation and the release of stress hormones like cortisol, part of that is just the normal stress adaptation process that's required if you want to get stronger, improve your endurance, build more mitochondria in your cells. You have to experience some level of stress. And I think this idea that, running makes you age faster is because you've looked at some of the first order effects of hard exercise. Oh, you're more sore after a run. Like you've released all of these, hormones that are
Yeah.
bad for muscle growth and all that. But they are the precursors to the adaptation process. And it's almost like we have to zoom out a little bit further, just wait a little bit longer until the body builds back a little bit stronger with a little bit more endurance. And then you're a little bit more capable. Like you said, the next time you go and do something silly, like try to run 20 miles, your body is a little bit more prepared for that. And without that stress, you're never going to get better. So I think it's really important to recognize that
Yeah.
those ill effects are actually needed and wanted as part of the training process. And then, of course, with you talking about sprints and strength training, that kind of talks to the fact that there's good training and there's bad training, right? You can train for a marathon in a way that is not very respectful of your body, and it probably can make you feel a lot worse and maybe hasten the aging process somewhat, especially if you're not really recovering from run to run. But I think one of the
Absolutely.
other great things about those uphill sprints you were talking about, or even flat sprints, is the hormonal side of that. That it gives your body such a different stimulus that it prompts your body to release different hormones than you would get if you did a long run or a threshold workout. And I think that's also important to counteract some of that aging process too.
Yeah, I mean, and muscles work. There's that sort of that cyclical kind of cycling in and out of different muscle fibers. And um, an analogy I've used in the book is that yes, you don't, you're not going to sprint. Maybe you're going to sprint to the finish line, of course, or maybe you'll need to just do a little kind of sprint to get round someone on a narrow part of the course or something like that. But really, the real benefit of getting those fast twitch fibers on board is that that cycling process, you're just getting more hands on deck. And I was saying it's a bit like a temping agency. Imagine your body's a temping agency, and when the workload gets really hard and bigger, that you need to kind of call in some temps to come and take some of that workload and help out. And you've actually just increased the pool of available workers by getting those muscle cells stimulated and switched on.
I love that analogy, Sam. I might be stealing that and using that in the future. I think that's just brilliant. And it really highlights the fact that, your body is such a complex system. We can't just run slow all the time and expect to be good at any race, or for that matter, run fast all the time. It's a very complex system, and we need to be working on different energy systems, be working on recruiting different muscle fiber types. And that is really going to be making us into a better athlete. Now, another big myth I wanted to get your thoughts on, this one comes across my coaching desk on the regular, and that's these runners who haven't run a marathon before, but they have some experience, but they're terrified of injuries. They think that if they're going to train for a marathon, they are undoubtedly going to get hurt. Injuries are just an inevitable part of the training process. And this idea is holding them back from registering for their first marathon and training for it. They just think the volume is going to be too high, or the whole training process is going to be so advanced that their body's not going to be able to handle it. Do you think injuries are inevitable in marathon training, and how can we address this?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I absolutely don't think that they're inevitable. It all depends on the approach. Going back to this idea of the traditional marathon program, where you've got this really steep mountain to climb just to get from where you are now to where you need to be, and you've got this kind of quite contained time period in which to do that. Well, that's kind of setting yourself up for injury right there. You are trying to fit in an awful lot into a short period of time if you're not suitably trained to train for the marathon. Like you were saying earlier, it's almost like you need to kind of do a training program to get yourself fit for the marathon training program, because it is going to be a short period of time. So I think taking away that pressure on yourself by being well prepared, like we were saying, maybe 10, 11, 12 miles is a really comfortable distance for you by the time you start the program. You're already, really helping yourself avoid injuries. So I think that's one part of it. Another part of it is that people's mentality when they are in the marathon training block, it tends to sort of slip into panic very, very quickly. And so when an injury, it's not really an injury, but, the beginnings of an injury start up, it's like, I can't stop because I've got to get to 20 miles by week 10 or whatever, and so they'll just kind of keep plowing on through this thing, which it's just a little bit of a niggle in the Achilles or a bit of a sore knee. Keep on running through it, keep following the program doggedly, whatever it says you've got to do, just keep on doing it. And then that thing that was just a little kind of niggle is going to turn into that full-blown injury that you could have avoided if you just stepped back, took a little bit of time out, just addressed it, had a sports massage, maybe getting to a check over to make sure that you've got any strength deficits that you need to work on, that kind of thing. I think that sort of head in the sand approach is what leads to so many injuries during marathon training, and we can avoid that. There's a lovely term, which is that if you listen to the whispers, then you won't have to hear the screams. And I think a lot of us are very good at kind of just ignoring those whispers, drowning them out, and then we wait until it's much later on and we have to then put up with the screams.
I like that analogy too. Another one I might be stealing from you.
I stole
kind of
that
look
from someone.
they're great analogies that really help us wrap our head around this topic. And I think it's such an interesting perspective, because I see rushing your training and trying to get up to about 20 miles and get that long run distance up. I look at that as almost the same psychological phenomenon as someone who gets a slight niggle during marathon training and thinks that all of their training is ruined. They're not going to be able to build their long run at the same, rate as their training plan says they should be. It's almost like this inability to slow down, this inability to sort of take the longer term view on your training. And I think that longer term outlook can be so helpful when it comes to injury prevention, because it prevents you from taking those risks with your running that often lead to injuries. Going out for that long run when you do have a niggle, only because you think you have to, because your training plan says you do. Can you speak to this idea of being a little bit more flexible with your training so that you're not rushing it?
Yeah. I mean, it's very much that idea that the program, it's again, that the program knows you, the program knows best. It knows, above everything else, it knows that you have to do everything that is written on this page. And that's the only way. It's like it's almost a sort of slightly mystical thing, isn't it? That if you do anything that is not on that program, or you miss something that's on it, that everything is going to fall apart. And when we just step back and think about that, we can easily see that that's just not the case. I mean, you probably, like me, have done a number of marathons where did you ever do a marathon, in fact, where you did every single thing that was on the program that you had written yourself or that you were following?
Of course not. No way.
No, I mean, that's right. And you'll get people sort of, I've worked with people and they'll come and sort of say, well, yeah, my foot was hurting, but I had my 18 miler on the plan, so I just did it, and now I can't walk. And you're like, why did you do that? And so I think it is much more like bringing bringing the chapter that I mentioned that I wanted to get in the book about, all about you. It's just remembering that you are part of this process, and your needs are part of this process. And if your body needs rest but the program says don't rest, it's you that you need to listen to. It's your body that you need to listen to. If you've got a niggle and you're concerned about that, address that specific thing and then rearrange what's around. And if you miss a couple of things, well, we'll let everybody into the secret that programs are always designed with an assumption that not every single thing in the entire plan is going to be ticked off. We kind of know that when we write these plans.
Yeah. I write what I call perfect ideal plans, but you don't have to follow it perfectly to get there. Um, I want to ask you another myth, and this one's a bit of a fun one, and it kind of speaks to this fact that us runners, we can be a little bit type A. We want to execute the plan perfectly. We never want to get injured. Um, and there's some runners who really want to abstain from all alcohol when they're training for a marathon. Now, I live in Denver, Colorado. We have a lot of breweries around here. I like myself a good beer. Can we responsibly enjoy a little bit of alcohol when we're marathon training?
I think we can. I mean, I have to confess here that I run a weekly group run from a brewery.
You'd fit in well in Denver.
So I'm kind of, yeah. So, we meet at the brewery, we go for a run, and then we come back and we drink beer. But in fact, the brewery very kindly created us a beer that they've called the Runner's Brew, which is just 1.6% alcohol. And that's absolutely fantastic. It's just the perfect, just enough to kind of get a little bit of a relaxing buzz, but not so much alcohol that you wake up feeling really dehydrated and jaded the next day. But yeah, to go back to the point, I mean, we're already lots of. I'm not going to argue for alcohol being, a kind of an elixir of health for sure. That's there's just not any evidence to suggest that it is, but by being regularly active, we're already kind of counteracting a lot of the effects of alcohol. There's been some studies on this, sort of showing that the people who are regularly active kind of negate some of the detrimental health effects of alcohol. And I think, it's very much an issue of, if you're going to deny yourself everything that you enjoy doing, just all in, in aid of your marathon, I think you're going to end up being, quite uptight and quite, unhappy, and maybe just a little bit kind of overly focused on this one thing. And most of us, um, who are in this conversation, I imagine, we're not trying for the Olympic trials. We're not. We want to do the best that we can, but we are people with other things in our lives. And I think the idea that anybody should prescriptively tell you, "Oh, you must not do that. You must not drink alcohol. You must not, you know, eat chocolate cake." Because you're trying to do a marathon. What are you doing? You're trying to train for a marathon. You shouldn't do that. I don't think anybody's really got the right to tell people to do that. And I definitely will enjoy a beer or a glass of wine, a couple of times a week. And I don't think that I would want to be the person advising other runners not to do that for the sake of their marathon success. Oh, I feel like a
I
politician.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I don't think I've heard this before, that running negates some of the negative effects of alcohol. So, hey, Sam Murphy said that I can drink as much booze as I want
Yeah.
as long as I'm running a lot, right? Is that the lesson here?
I will find you the study, Jason. I'll find you the study because I did write something about it when it came out, and I found it quite an interesting and heartening piece of research. So I will find that for you, and
Yeah,
I'll
we'll
share it
include
with
it in the
you.
show notes. I think it's amazing. It's music to many runners' ears, but of course, as long as you're
Sure.
being responsible with it, as long as I think the number one negative effect might be the disruption to your sleep, which is really important for recovery. So, for any runner who's training really hard right now, probably want to limit your alcohol intake so that you can still get a good night's sleep that same night, and it's not
Yeah,
really
sleep is
contributing to the
really
loss of, right.
Yeah, definitely. Sleep is really important. And also, yeah, it's, the day that you've done your long run is not the day to then go and, drink 5 pints of beer. It's, that's when you've created, this kind of series of breakdowns of different substances, and you've got, metabolites and inflammation in the body, and that repair process is all part of the kind of progress of your fitness. And so the dehydration and the effects on growth hormone that come from heavy drinking. But it's interesting, that a lot of the studies that have been done on the effects of drinking have used incredibly high volumes of alcohol. I mean, the sort of volume where you really would be on a massive binge. I mean, it's not about going and having like one or two beers after a run. I mean, when I looked into this, um, some of the studies were just crazy amounts of alcohol that I just don't think anyone who's interested in their health and their running would really be drinking anyway.
Yeah, it's always funny looking at how those studies were put together because, yeah, first of all, they're usually with like a handful of college-aged men, which certainly skews the results. But yeah, if
Not
they're
known for their drinking, of course.
no, no, never, never. I would never run a Saturday race and then go out with my friends in college. That never happened, Sam. But yeah, it's really interesting because some of the volumes used, it's like 6, 7, 8 plus individual
Sure.
alcoholic drinks. And,
Yeah.
I think for a college aged guy, like, yeah, you're probably going out and having too much fun. But for most adults, that is a little bit much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this was really fun, Sam, and I'm glad that you're on board with a little bit of responsible drinking because I think it'd be hard to live here in Denver and not enjoy the brewery scene while you're training. Your book, "Run Your Best Marathon: Your Trusted Guide to Training and Racing Better," is such a comprehensive look at modifying marathon training to work for you. So, thanks so much for releasing this into the world. I'll have a link to your book in the show notes on the Strength Running site. But Sam, thanks so much for joining me and talking more about the marathon and all these myths that sometimes hold us runners back.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Jason.